Disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
God said, and behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is on the earth shall die.
The most compelling evidence for a global flood is the sediment record itself. All over the earth, what's under your feet, hundreds of distinct horizontal layers, generally with smooth interfaces between the layers. The only way that such a record could have come into existence is global scale processes producing the whole record in a single global event.
All over the world, the layers are flat and there's no river channels in them. Think about what you see at the Grand Canyon. You see these flat pancakes, one on top of another, just flat, 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 flat. They're basically erosionless. Here's how they formed. At the beginning of the flood, there was movements of the crust. Crustal movements actually cause earthquakes. Earthquakes in water cause tsunamis. The tsunamis then originating from the ocean areas would then race across the continents. Once the tsunami lost its power, the sediment would settle down out of the water and form a flat layer at the bottom. That's the first layer. Then another earthquake in a different part of the world sets off a tsunami, maybe a week later, maybe a day later, brings in a different sediment, The tsunami runs out of power in this area. The sediments in the water settle to the bottom and form another flat layer. There's no erosion. Again, you have a third tsunami bringing in these sediments, third layer.
My simulations indicate that these tsunamis were large enough for a single tsunami to sweep all the way across a continent.
These layers were formed underwater. That's why they were so confusing to so many people. It's fascinating to see the evolution scientists explain their dig sites. For example, at Dinosaur Provincial Park, they have 10,000 dinosaurs buried in this flat layer. And you ask the site paleontologist, well, how did these 10,000 dinosaurs get in this flat layer? Well, they died in a river in flood. Oh, what was the shape of the river bottom? It was a flat river bottom. So you're saying this river that was so strong that could bury 10,000 dinosaurs over 5 miles wide, which would be a raging river, wasn't strong enough to cause an erosion channel? Why isn't there a river cut from this river channel? Why isn't there erosion from that river? The answers make no sense in light of this flat problem, the erosionless problem.
What we see at the Grand Canyon is that the layers got bent at the edge of the plateau. Because the folding was smooth when the sediments were still soft, the whole sequence had to be formed rapidly during the flood and then bent at the end of the flood while they were still wet. And so these folds are very strategic evidence tying together all the layers, and it emphatically demonstrates that the millions of years never happened.
Or the fact that you have what are called polystrate fossils. They're usually trees that go through more than one layer.
These trees have 3 layers that are supposedly 30 million years worth of rock around them. You know that if you start accumulating sediment around the bottom, the sediment would eat away at the bark would rot, and the tree would die even sooner, would fall over even less than 100 years. But here we have trees, vertical, fossilized with 3 layers. In the worldwide flood, trees were swept up and they were floating on the top. Now, eventually, the trees became waterlogged and sank to the bottom. Now, trees normally sink horizontal, but some trees, as discovered by Dr. Steve Austin, when they sink vertically. If a tsunami wave comes, and there was a lot of tsunami waves during the flood, and brings in sediment, when the tsunami wave loses power, the sediment in the wave settles into a flat layer at the bottom. Maybe a week later or a day later, another tsunami wave comes in from a different direction. When the tsunami wave loses its power, the sediment begins to fall, and now it forms a second layer on top of the first, amongst this vertical tree that hasn't fossilized yet. Now, if that tree could be buried with 30 feet of sediment in just, say, a week, you could easily accumulate the entire Grand Canyon stacked layers in a year's time. It is the explanation that defeats the evolution time, and it actually defeats the theory of evolution. This is the single most important geological fact, and nobody seems to teach us in college or in the evolution world.
Evolutionists claim that the Earth is millions of years old, and one of their so-called proofs are stratified rock layers found within the geologic column. Evolutionists teach that each layer represents millions of years of rock formation based upon their uniformitarian view that says you can make assumptions about the past based upon processes today. But in doing so, you're assuming that there were no catastrophic events like a global flood. Evolutionists also ignore the flood evidence contained within these rock layers, like sea creatures mixed together with land creatures. Just ask any coal miner. Anywhere on Earth they dig, they find countless sea creatures embedded in the rock. You see, the Bible refutes evolution theory, stating that it has only been roughly 6,000 years since the beginning of creation, giving the true account of how the sedimentary layers formed, as sedimentary rock is rock that is formed in water. which is also incredible testimony of a worldwide flood, given that the Earth's surface is made up mostly of water-formed sedimentary rock layers. The fact that the layers were actually formed in water also explains why there is no erosion found in between the layers, as there would be if the layers took millions of years to form. Then there's the issue of bended and folded rock, which could only occur if the layers were pliable and soft at the time of the bending, which is exactly what a global flood would cause. The bent layers also prove that their formation was rapid, with multiple layers forming rapidly on top of each other, because the bottom layers would still have to be saturated with water and didn't have enough time to dry out. As forces acted upon the layers, they bent in unison from top to bottom. Claiming these layers folded together over millions of years while still forming cannot explain what geologists are observing. Only underwater rapid burial could explain these phenomena, remembering that sedimentary rock layers, of which these are formed in water in the first place. To further prove that these rock layers were formed quickly and in the flood is the fact that in countless places around the world we find polystrate trees. Poly meaning many, and straight referring to the multiple layers that these trees are running through. If you understand anything about how organic matter decomposes, you'll know that it's impossible for trees to remain intact for millions of years while layers of dirt and debris slowly pile around them, and rain and moisture rot the wood out. Instead, what the evidence shows is that trees were swept up in the flood and carried off, and as they became more waterlogged, they sank. Some trees would sink uniformly, while other trees contained more water saturation in what was left of their bottom roots. These trees would be bottom heavy and float down to the floor but rest upright. Tsunami waves would carry in sediments that would bury the trees quickly in multiple layers. In fact, geologists discovered that the same sand from the eastern side of America had been carried in tsunami waves all the way to the west side of the continent. This explains how the rock layers contained fossils of sea creatures mixed in with land plants. And it also explains why the trees are missing their root systems, and most importantly, why the trees are found running straight through multiple rock layers that evolutionists are claiming are millions of years old. Let's also not forget that some of these layers are the size of continents, indicating that these trees and rocks were laid down in a single and catastrophic event, and not local floods at different times. Today, we assume that fossils are a normal part of the cycle of life, since we see so many of them all over the world. Yet, fossilization is not what we observe at all when something dies today. Thankfully, dead matter does not fossilize today under normal conditions, but instead, God made dead matter to break down and return to the earth. The fact that we see so many fossils indicates that there was a worldwide event that caused mass fossilization of all life on Earth at one point in time. Think about it. If the Earth today is covered 71% in water, water-formed sedimentary rock layers made up most of the rock on Earth. Inside those rock layers are sea creatures mixed in with land creatures. Some of these sedimentary layers span entire continents, meaning they were formed all together in one event. Multiple layers are bent and folded together, proving rapid burial events created them. We find trees spanning through multiple layers of rock, and all over the globe we find massive areas of erosion, such as great canyons carved out. It is obvious that God left all of this evidence behind as a testimony to the biblical flood.
The second most powerful evidence are the fossils that are in these sedimentary layers. To produce a fossil requires, in most cases, especially for the larger kinds of organisms, requires complete burial and rapid burial. And that automatically speaks of catastrophic conditions. So the fact that we find so many fossils, so well preserved, many of them with evidence that the animals were buried alive, is another powerful evidence for a flood cataclysm.
Every non-flood geologist on our planet believes that the planet Mars had a global flood. Creationists do believe, like the unbelievers, like the secular geologists believe, Mars did have a flood. We think it happened the same time our flood did, maybe an asteroid storm hitting the inner planets, the rocky planets. Here on our planet, we're now currently covered 70% with water, 2 miles deep, and they can't buy that we once had a flood. It's very, very easy for them to believe that Mars had a global flood, but for some reason they can't accept there's plenty of evidence that we've had a flood. Where did all the water come from for the flood? I mean, where did it come from and where did it go? Well, look at the globe. We're 3/4 covered with water 2 miles deep now. It's all still here.
The most asked questions are, where did the water come from for the flood and where did it go? And the answer is easily explained in the model of catastrophic plate tectonics.
The process of catastrophic plate tectonics is very similar to conventional plate tectonics. The main difference is the speed or the rate at which these processes unfold. Today, the plates are moving about a few inches per year. However, during the flood, a billion times faster. When the flood began, it began with these fountains on the bottom of the deep ocean.
Where the Bible even says the fountains of the great deep were opened up. The mid-ocean ridge is 44,000 miles long. Most of it is underwater. That's why they call it the mid-ocean ridge. And if it all erupted at the same time, it would have made the ocean floor do this, wham, and then the mid-ocean ridge would have erupted all around the world at the same time, roughly. But that first phase, wham, would have caused sea level to rise a mile, plow. Then this tidal wave coming out from that sudden rise at the ocean floor in the middle headed towards the continents. Now, that would have been the phase 1 of the flood. The second phase of the flood, it says, was when the windows of heaven were open.
It's no accident that there's an order given there in the scriptures. The fountains of the deep broke open, that is the crust breaking open, the water shooting up, the supersonic steam jets, and carrying that ocean water up, then it fell as global torrential rainfall.
People all know the flood was 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days.
When the fountains of the great deep broke open, as the Bible describes, that's the description of the fracturing of the pre-flood crust. You've got molten material that's expanding as it solidifies. The new ocean floor expanded. That pushed up sea level. That means that the ocean floor is actually going to rise. The ocean waters rose up to cover the continents. The new ocean floor cooled and it shrank, and therefore sea level fell and the ocean waters drained off. The flood waters are still present on the Earth's surface today. They went into the new ocean basins that were produced as a consequence of the flood. In fact, the Earth is still 70% covered in water.
Yeah, the water's still here. It's deep in those trenches. Some of the trenches are 8. Now we find out 10 miles deep. If we had lower land formations and a higher ocean floor, we would probably be a water planet today with no land surface. And it's scraping the bottom of the barrel to try to say, where did all the water go? It's still here, and it's very easy to explain that the same water, mostly the same water that's here, would have been adequate to have flooded the earth at one time, and that the situation has changed. That water is now in deeper basins. Not a problem in the flood model at all.
We're all familiar with the theory about Pangaea, which holds that the continents were once connected to form a supercontinent that later broke apart through a process called plate tectonics. Catastrophic plate tectonics is essentially the same idea as conventional plate tectonics, except that the timeline and events are all centered around the year of the flood instead of millions of years of slow processes. You may be surprised to learn that it was a man named Abraham Ortelius, a famous cartographer from the 1500s, who first proposed the idea that the flood of Noah may have been responsible for tearing apart the Americas from Europe and Africa. Hundreds of years later, another Christian by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini would first theorize the modern concept of continental drift, in which he illustrated two maps depicting the continents of the world as once joined together. This was decades before German geologist Alfred Wegener would propose his own version of the theory, known today as Pangea, and be erroneously dubbed the father of continental drift. Antonio was snubbed of this honorary title. His crime was citing the book of Genesis, in which he said he made the discovery that at the beginning of creation, there was only one continent. You see, the book of Genesis laid out exactly what happened to the earth in the past during the flood, starting with what the Bible calls the fountains of the great deep opening. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that technology initially developed to detect submarines underwater would stumble across these gigantic scars from the fountains of the great deep that had split open, exactly as the Bible had described. How did a book, thousands of years old, know exactly what was at the bottom of the ocean floor? The Bible says that first, these giant subterranean rifts broke open, piercing the earth's crust, spewing magma that created steam jets that shot up into the sky. Then the book of Genesis says that the waters poured down as torrential rain through the windows of heaven that were opened up, and that the rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights. The supercontinent that the book of Genesis described is now beginning to break apart. At first, the newly partitioned continents oscillate, slamming into each other before starting their ultimate journey of separation. This closes seaways and forms volcanoes and mountains in the Americas and Europe, such as the Appalachian and Caledonian ranges. The seafloor spreads, forming from molten magma, widening the separation between the new continents. Scientists will later discover that the seafloor at the mid-Atlantic ridge is much younger than the seafloor in other parts of the world, exactly as the Bible suggests. As this newly emerging volcanic floor spreads, it subducts under the west coast of North America, binding and releasing, causing massive tsunamis, carrying mud mixed with sea creatures, totally overwhelming the land. As what's known as the Kondratyevsky Rise pushes up during the subduction, the Rocky Mountains also begin to form, along with the Independence Dyke Swarm, a 400-mile-long volcanic region that billows ash that covers half of America. As the western interior seaway emerges during this time, the last of the dinosaurs are flooded, mixed together with sea life, and are buried in mud, sand, and ash in the middle of America. As we near the end of the flood, activity begins to cease as the seafloor stops spreading and begins to cool. As the new massive ocean floors cool and retract, the waters reverse back down into the new ocean basins and recede as much as a mile. All over the earth, trillions of fossils are left behind as incredible evidence of the worldwide catastrophic flood. 1993, a film titled Jurassic Park featured a rather famous scene in which the remains of an ancient mosquito were preserved, encased in a ball of hardened amber. The film goes on to explain that the way scientists could resurrect dinosaurs from the past was by extracting blood from the remains inside this mosquito, in which dinosaur DNA could be fully sequenced, by combining what was missing with that of a modern-day frog. This idea came about because back in the 90s, the writer Michael Crichton was struggling to come up with a concept to explain how dinosaurs could somehow be brought back to life in a feasible way in his book of the same title. What the Jurassic Park creators couldn't have imagined was the discovery of soft tissue inside of a dinosaur bone. a finding that has since been replicated by other scientists, such as this stretching Triceratops tissue, discovered by Mark Armitage. These discoveries shocked the entire paleontological community and would likely have rewritten the original Jurassic Park film had they known this was possible at the time. In fact, scientists have run into major challenges when attempting to publish these findings because of the wholesale rejection that dinosaur soft tissue could even still exist. The consensus at the time agreed that it was completely impossible, because everyone held to the widespread belief that the bones were millions of years old, which would require that all of their biomaterial had long since fossilized. There was simply no way that these dinosaur bones contained biomaterial like blood vessels and proteins such as collagen. In fact, of these 16 types of bioorganic materials that have since been discovered inside dinosaur bones, collagen by itself ends the debate on these bones being millions of years old, as the maximum age of collagen is as low as 10,000 years by some estimates and as high as 900,000 years by others, with 100,000 years being the generally agreed upon maximum age. To put this into perspective, if each of these tiny bars represents a period of 100,000 years, then only one of these bars represents the maximum age collagen could survive over time. If we zoom out to the time span of 100 million years, then we can see that the lifespan of collagen is 1,000 times shorter than the general age evolutionists claim dinosaur bones are. Or another way to say it is that collagen doesn't even last 0.001% as long as it would have to in order for evolution theory to work, proving that it's not even remotely within the realm of possibility that collagen could survive for so long. The relatively short shelf life of collagen proves what the Bible has been saying about these bones all along, that they're roughly 4,400 years old and were buried all over the world around the time of Noah's flood. As the flood waters began to recede, the earth was in a state of chaos. Dinosaur graveyards like these would later be found all over the earth, and secular paleontologists agree that these worldwide sites share one thing in common. The state the bones are found in all show evidence of flood burial. And now you understand exactly where the water came from. Water that would eventually dry up because it didn't belong there in the first place. The whole earth would undergo a massive reset as vegetation would slowly grow back and water would find its final resting places. Sadly, the earth that was once a perfect habitat for dinosaurs was now irrevocably ruined, and those dinosaurs that were able to survive would be hunted to extinction over time. We know them as dinosaurs, but legend would remember them as dragons. And so it was that on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. It was a little over a year after the flood began that Noah, his family, and all on board the ark would finally step onto dry land again. This group of 8 people would repopulate the earth, just as legends around the world cite in their historical literature. And science would later prove that this genetic bottleneck really did occur. exactly as the Bible had told us all along.
In terms of looking at the way ideas progress, we know that history can become more mythical. Myth, as a core idea, cannot become more historical. It doesn't go the other way. History can become more historical. Myth becomes more mythical. And if you start with myth, you end up with myth. You can never go the other way. So we can see as a genre how different they are.
There's been about 200 flood traditions discovered by anthropologists and missionaries and others. And many of these flood traditions come from people groups that don't even live near the ocean.
There are hundreds of flood legends from around the world, but in many of these cases, you have huge similarities to the biblical account. You have one righteous family that is saved, and the reason for the flood is because God was angry. The gods were angry at something that humanity had done.
They all talk about man and animals surviving on some kind of a boat. There are lots of similarities, but the true account is in Genesis. Some of the evidence of that is just in the description of the ark. The Babylonian Gilgamesh epic has a cube for the ark. Well, that would just roll in the water and everything would die.
The biblical account has a flood that's duration is 371 days. But when we come to the Gilgamesh epic, it's merely 6 days. It only took 1 week to build this huge ark, where it took Noah probably 55 years or something in that range to construct his ark.
The biblical account is the true account, and these other stories are the result of people migrating from the Tower of Babel after the flood and preserving in their memory an echo of the true account that is recorded in Genesis. And the farther they moved away from the Middle East and any contact with the true account, the more the story got corrupted over time. And so that explains the differences as well as the similarities.
The biblical account, by all measure, stands independent from the others. They certainly had a common core in history. There was an event that happened.
We've actually recorded about 23 different accounts that are very similar to Babel, where people were trying to build this tower and the gods were angry, or God was angry and forced them to scatter by confusing their language. And then from Genesis 12 onward, we don't see similarities anymore. There's no Abraham legend, there's no Isaac legend or David legend, anything like that. But Genesis 1 through 11, people all around the globe seem to know about. Why? Well, because what the Bible's telling us is true. And up until Genesis 11 at the Babel event, mankind had a shared history. And then they took that history with them, they passed it along, and it gets distorted as the years go by. After the flood, God blesses Noah and his sons, tells them to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, the same sort of thing that he told Adam and Eve. So in a sense, man gets to start over. And yet what do we see just a few generations later? The people refuse to scatter.
They said, no, we're going to stay right here in the Mesopotamian Valley. And they began to build a tower. They had a one world government. Genesis 11 tells us that God stopped that building project by supernaturally creating different languages to force the people to move apart according to their families into different nations.
It may surprise you to learn that all of the rock layers of the world, the named rock layers like the Cambrian, the Jurassic, all of the layers of the world have saltwater creatures. Well, what greater proof would you need that this was from a worldwide flood, that there's saltwater creatures in all the layers? Now, this is in the middle of the continents. How did these saltwater creatures get here? It would have to be a flood. Now, the evolution scientists have to explain where these saltwater creatures came from, how they got there. You're saying, Mr. Evolution Scientist, that there's saltwater creatures in all these layers, and you're saying the oceans rose, covered the middle of the United States, and went back down, went back up, went back down, multiple times, at least a dozen times. Occam's razor would say, it's more simple to believe in one flood than more than a dozen worldwide floods.
It was in the 1980s that the secular geologists began to move to catastrophism and move away from uniformitarianism as soon as it suited their needs. They went to catastrophism when it served their purposes to help explain the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Noah's flood provides a better explanation for the demise of the dinosaurs than the impact in Yucatan, simply because that event is so small, so localized, there's no way it could have a physical effect that would would cause the dinosaurs to be buried the way we find them. And nobody in the secular world even claims that. They say, well, it produced climate change that caused the dinosaurs to starve to death.
If you go on Wikipedia today and look up dinosaur extinction or Chicxulub crater, an asteroid sunk and hit the Earth, caused a global cooling because of all the dust in the air, and the dinosaurs died out at that time.
We have simulations where we've thrown the Chicxulub size meteorite on the Earth using high performance computing, and then we get the subduction event and we get the breakup of the lithosphere and we start the earthquakes, we start the volcanoes. Actually, meteoritic impacts could have initiated that event.
But it has no power to explain the burial of these huge animals in the sediment record.
In the 1980s, secular scientists began to theorize that it was an asteroid that crashed into the Earth and wiped out nearly all of life on its surface. The theory posits that massive tsunamis and volcanic dust-filled air as a result of the impact are what destroyed the dinosaurs and most other life in a worldwide disaster. Secular scientists could not escape the fact that water and volcanism played a massive role in how life was once wiped out on Earth. But the Bible had already written that the Earth had been catastrophically destroyed through volcanism and water, and they didn't want to validate the Bible. So they came up with their own catastrophic version of events, i.e., the asteroid impact theory. You see, the Bible's book of Genesis had already made clear what happened in the past in detail, describing volcanic activity bursting open from the ocean floors, chronicling when the volcanic activity began and ceased, how long the rain poured, how high the waters reached, as well as giving the very reason why God judged and destroyed the world with the flood in the first place. You are essentially given two choices today. On the one hand, you have a book written thousands of years ago giving an amazingly detailed account of a worldwide flood that wiped out virtually all life on Earth. On the other hand, you have man-made theories, in this case, one that was only first postulated about 40 years ago due to the inadequacy of their prior non-catastrophic models that they know really didn't work. Both views require a catastrophic event with global implications, but only one has the power to actually explain the stratification of the Earth's surface and the trillions of fossils, along with cultures around the world citing a global flood in their historical writings and legends, while the other merely rearranges elements from the true account to concoct its own story. Think about it. The Bible already said long ago that the entire world's surface was destroyed catastrophically. They have no choice but to make that same claim. The Bible said that the continents were once together in the beginning. It looks like they have to share that too. Nearly all animal life on Earth was wiped out during the destruction, a fact that they also couldn't ignore. Marine life was scattered across the world. The Bible says the waters went above the highest mountains. Secular scientists formulated their own theories as to how to explain the marine fossils away. The Earth's original environment was permanently destroyed. The pre-flood paradise was gone. In the secular model, they refer to this as the prehistoric world going extinct. And let's not forget that the flood set the processes into motion for much of the world to be frozen over. Hot oceans produce evaporations and greater snowfall. Volcanoes send volumes of aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking the sun. Greater snowfall with cooler summers results in global ice sheets. Evolutionists have called these results of the flood the Ice Age. One of these is constantly being proven true as more and more evidence is discovered over time, while the other was only invented after the evidence was unearthed. And further still, contained within the Bible, is also the prediction that all of this would happen. In the second book of Peter, we are told that in the last days, which is the time fast approaching, unbelievers would be willingly ignorant of the flood, meaning that secular men and women would consciously choose to believe and create lies that allow them to push the catastrophic event into the distant past, so long ago and so far away it ceases to be scientific history and becomes scientific fantasy. The irony can only be described as biblical. The Bible makes it clear that the end times would be characterized by increasing unbelief of the biblical account of history and the flood event itself. Sadly, the religion of evolution is one in which its priests are constantly updating their outdated theories, while in the Bible, we are given the final, true, and unchanging account. And as the evidence is unearthed over time, the biblical account is always proven to be true.
If you go to a museum today and look at the dinosaur displays, you'll notice that the animals look strange and unusual with the dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a boa constrictor at a museum display wrapped around a T-Rex's leg? No, but they have found boa constrictors with dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a box turtle at the feet of a Stegosaurus? No, but they found box turtles with dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a T-Rex with a duck flying over him? No, but ducks have been found with dinosaurs. All 7 groups of animals today have been found with the dinosaurs, and they look the same. Museum displays don't show that. So if they actually put the animals they found with the dinosaurs, people would look at those displays and say, well, evolution hasn't occurred, it's just the dinosaurs went extinct. But scientists have withheld the modern animals from their dinosaur displays to promote the idea that evolution occurred.
You know, the soft tissue analysis in dinosaurs that's been recent has been a little bit of an enigma to those who believe that the Earth and the universe is really old. Mary Schweitzer in the 1990s and the early 2000s first found this like elastic material in arteries. Elastic material means you pull it and it reloads back to its original place.
Dinosaur soft tissue is a very recent finding. They don't want it really getting out. It's not in any of the textbooks. This lady cracked open or cut open one of the bones, and you could smell the putrefaction. Dinosaur bones shouldn't smell like they're dying because they've been dead for millions of years, right?
Well, a little bit later, Mark Armitage started looking at the horn of the Triceratops, but he found bone materials, tissue and bone, the osteocytes, that actually you pull it and it had strains. Strains are how much you deform something. It had up to almost 100% strain.
Muscle tissue in the Santana-raptor fossil, and it was like dinosaur beef jerky on the leg bone of a dinosaur. It was the actual muscle.
And this Thescelosaurus bone, the same thing. We started looking inside of this bone and we found using scanning electron microscopy that it had elastic material, it had tissue. You pull it apart and it goes back. If this was mineralized or it was a fossil that became a rock, you couldn't do this. So it was never mineralized, never petrified. It was still elastic, meaning it was still the tissue. That means this thing is not 100 million years old.
The biblical account expects to find some of that stuff. So like, what was it? Bone marrow?
Red blood cells,
cartilage,
collagen,
hemoglobin,
and muscle fiber proteins. These things shouldn't be able to last but 100,000 years tops. But these things were 100 million years old. Okay, 68 million years old, but closer to 100 million. The amino acids in the protein strands would unbuckle and fall apart into protein powder, and there is no explanation to this day. Nothing that makes any decent scientific sense, and it's just been left as an anomaly. Neil deGrasse Tyson interviewed Mary Schweitzer and some others, and then turned the attention to the medullary layer. They tried to distract the attention away from the red blood cells. The medullary layer was there, showing that the T-Rex that this bone came from was at the time carrying eggs. That's really what we call a shell game, a smoke and mirrors game, a dog and pony show meant to distract away from the elephant in the room, which was there were proteins in that T-Rex bone. Now, Mark Armitage, working at University of California, did find soft tissue inside of a Triceratops horn, and when he published that finding, they fired him. So they are willingly ignorant, squelching the truth, and this is actually not science. This is propaganda. Now we're talking about thought control and the mind police. They wanted to fire him because they felt that this was a religious position when really he had only brought forth a scientific discovery.